Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back, or welcome here in this Loods 7, the keynote space for today. And we have a very lovely guest here presenting us and tell us about the relational feedback encounters in higher education. We're really honored that she came over from London. She works at the Surrey University, and we are really happy that she wants to be here and tell us everything about her research from last years. In the last 10 years, we have seen her name several times in all the projects we did with the platform. And my suggestion is just let's hear what she has to tell. So thank you for being here, Karen, and we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Martin, for this invitation to be here as part of this festival. It might be a bit sort of crackly. And it's honestly such a pleasure to be here with all of you to talk about feedback and feedback practices and feedback literacies. I was also reflecting on what a pleasure it is to be part of this event, this unusual conference in such a fantastic setting. I was just sort of relaxing outside and looking at everybody enjoying the sunshine and the fresh air and the outside spaces. And I was thinking there could not be a more perfect location for a talk about the importance of environment and space in thinking about how it shapes our practices. Am I okay? Not too crackly? A bit crackly? Is it a bit crackly? Just want to fix me. Thank you. That's better, isn't it? Yeah. It just feels so wonderful to be in this space and to talk with you all about my research and my teaching in this area of feedback practices in higher education. So a little bit about me then. So as Martin said, I'm from the University of Surrey, which is in Guildford in the UK, and I've been working in higher ed for the last 20 years in different roles in universities. And at the moment, my role is researching how students learn with respect to concepts like engagement, feedback and belonging in higher education. I also lead a programme, a PG Cert, which is a master's level programme for developing teachers. And on that programme, we have a lot of discussion about feedback and what makes feedback effective. So really pleased to share my experiences and research with you today. But I'm also really looking forward to hearing a little bit about your research and your questions. And at the end of the talk, there'll be plenty of time, I hope, for us to have a discussion and to have some questions from you as well. Okay, so let's begin then. So let's begin by thinking about my topic. And of course, I want to start by thinking about what we're here to discuss, which is feedback in higher education. And feedback in higher education, the research in this area has flourished over the past few decades. It's recognised as a really important area of policy and practice. And many of you, I'm sure, will be involved in research in this important area. We know that feedback is a fundamental tool to fostering learning, but yet at the same time, it's actually really hard to get right, isn't it? On this slide, I've got an image of the National Student Satisfaction Survey in the UK, and a key area of that survey that always showcases students' dissatisfaction with their university experiences in the assessment and feedback section. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on how feedback and feedback practices remain so durable and so dissatisfying, despite our work researching them and our work teaching teachers to support students to engage with feedback. It remains a really challenging area to get right. And I think that's an interesting thing to reflect upon. Because we know it's important, and we know it's important and we want to get it right, but we struggle to get it right. However, in recent years, as I mentioned, the research in this area is really just burgeoning, and it's exciting. We know also that increasingly researchers are looking at this concept of feedback literacies as well. And there's been talks today at this event on feedback literacies, and many of you, I'm sure, will be involved in thinking with this concept of feedback literacy. And what's happened, I think, in the sector is we've really caught on to the importance of understanding how students engage with feedback in order to get feedback right. So say 10, 20 years ago, we were very much of the mindset that feedback was a piece of information that we as teachers would transmit to our students. And then really, once we've delivered this information, our sort of feedback, the feedback was done. And it was up to us just to sort of give the content and write the content. But in recent years, feedback research has focused on this need to understand the literacies of students and to foster engagement with the feedback information that tutors provide. And that's really, really helpful, I think. And in these sources, it focuses on that students' engagement with feedback elements. Particularly, I'm thinking about this article by David Carlos and Dave Bowd, very, very highly cited article where the two Davids explore what students' engagement with feedback might look like, and they offer a definition of feedback literacy, which really focuses on the need for students to appreciate their feedback, to manage their effect, to make judgments, and to take action. So we've moved, I think, in the literature from feedback as information to feedback as student engagement. However, I think while this shift is incredibly helpful, I think for me what it overlooks is actually all of the multiple actors and elements that impact upon the feedback interaction or the feedback encounter. And I can't help but reflect in an environment like today's, just the huge impact of those kinds of actors. And I want to talk a bit more about them in what I conceptualize as feedback literacies as relational encounters. So I feel that in the literature so far, we've seen that the feedback research, and actually educational research as a whole, is very much informed by psychological traditions of research. And they often commonly adopt a cognitive approach to thinking about how learning happens. The conceptions of feedback literacy often define a binary dialogic relationship between teacher and student. And while helpfully we've moved beyond just looking at what the teacher does, we've actually shifted to placing the onus on what the student needs to do to manage their effect, to take action, and to make judgments. So we're still very, very much focused on just the teacher and just the student. And actually what I find really helpful is to draw upon some theories to think with, and I'm going to talk about them today in my talk, posthumanist and sociomaterial theories, which encourage us to think a little bit differently about educational encounters and about the way that learning is encouraged, constrained, and shaped by the situated environments in which we learn. So really, really helpful ways to look again at educational practices. And I think that this is really important because we know, and we're increasingly aware that student engagement is incredibly complex. For me, this really became apparent during the COVID pandemic. You know, when I was teaching from home, online, my students who were stuck in their bedrooms, you know, struggling to engage. And I know I wasn't the only one in this very, very challenging situation. Still brings back tears to my eyes. But the outcome of that situation was it really brought home to me just the reasons why some people cannot engage and they're not always transparent. It's not always easy for people to manage effect, to take action, to respond and engage with their feedback. And actually what I worry about is that if we focus on students as engaging with feedback, and actually feedback literacy is a skill located within students, it leads us to actually some deficit approaches of thinking of students who cannot engage as lacking in feedback literacy skills. I feel that we need to move away from the notion of an agentic, context-free, neoliberal individual And this is supported by some really interesting and fascinating research in the sector that's happening and looking at this idea of student engagement. I love this article. It's one of my favourites by Leslie Gourley at UCL because she talks about student engagement and the tyranny of participation. Now, I remember when I first saw this, I thought, how could engagement or participation ever be tyrannical? Surely it's lovely and wonderful. But of course, what she does in this paper, oh yes, oh thank you. I'm going to get fixed again. Is that better? Oh, thank you. What she does in this paper is she explores the multiple reasons that are not always transparent to us as teachers. Even though we care, we don't always see them. But the multiple reasons why students can't or maybe cannot engage in the ways that we perceive engagement. She talks about how when we talk about engagement, we often talk about active, visible, hands up, group work. And she talks about how for some introverted students or students from different cultures, that engagement might take a very, very different form. And actually, we perhaps need to be alert to the complexities of engagement. And this book, Student Engagement in the Digital University, also explores the increased complexity of engagement within the digital context and how digital settings really, really change the ways in which we might be able to engage with learning. And all of this is super relevant for feedback practices. So I find it really, really helpful to think about these ideas. And I also find it helpful to think and unpack the idea of dialogue. So a lot of the thinking and research and practice we're doing at the moment is celebrating dialogue and celebrating the dialogic interactions that we have with students. Dialogue is wonderful, and we're talking about it as a solution to a lot of problems within education. Now, I completely agree that dialogic interactions and dialogic feedback is really, really positive and helpful. However, it's not as simple as it seems. We know as teachers that when we say, well, I told my students, I told them, I don't know why they don't know because we covered it in class, or you have a conversation with your student later and you're not communicating, something is blocking. Dialogue is not as simple as it seems. And I really like this article from the critical pedagogic theorist Elizabeth Ellsworth. Why doesn't this feel empowering? Working through the repressive myths of critical pedagogy. In this article, she takes apart dialogue in what I just thought was really, again, like the tyranny of engagement. I thought it was really revolutionary because I thought, but dialogue's wonderful. How can it be problematic? And she says, well, acting as if our classroom were a safe space in which democratic dialogue was possible and happening did not make it so. So she is calling us to have a look at the power relations, the material constraints, the spatial issues, the other actors that might inhibit the understanding of our students, even when we're having conversations. And I love that quote, because we often hear, don't we, people saying, well, I make my classroom a safe space. So what's the problem? All my students feel welcome. All my students can ask me questions. Why don't they? And we know that there's power relations that sometimes we as teachers don't understand or can't see. And I think it's really helpful to think about this with respect to feedback. So often I encounter in my work with teachers at my university and beyond, the idea that teaching is this cognitive process of information transition. This is taken for granted and it still abounds. It's still a very prominent discourse in my experience. And universities like this, they do, because they would like it to be simple and generalizable. What works approaches are good for universities because we can roll them out. We can ensure it's happening. We can check it's happening. And they'd love education to be content delivery so that we could deliver it systematically and reliably. But actually, we as teachers know from our encounters with our students that teaching and learning is so situated and so affective. It's bound up with our emotions. It's situated in particular practices, spaces, and environments. And so what then might be worth thinking about in order to understand students' situated experiences of learning? And some of the things that I want to talk about this afternoon is thinking about spaces, objects, and the materialities. In educational research, we have focused so much on dialogue and on people and on what happens between students and between teachers, that the material is a less explored area of our practice, but so important. Think about how we feel in this space, in this conference today. And the relations between people, yes, but also things. And thinking about relations encourages us to think about concepts like trust and vulnerability, but also power relations, and also mattering, how students experience a sense of mattering, and also what matters within the particular encounter that we're working on. So I want to draw upon some research, starting with this study that I wrote a few years ago now. And in this study, I make the argument that feedback encounters and literacies are relational. So I explore them as emergent moments that happen when people and things come together. And this idea of a feedback encounter being an emergent moment, for me, is really helpful because it encourages us to think about the transience of it, the variability of the moment, but also the different actors that might shape that moment. And I also want to draw on this article as well, where David Carlos and I explored the relational, emergent, and contested nature of feedback literacies. So some of the ideas that we explore in these papers are thinking about feedback literacies less as attributes to be possessed inside a student and more as something that's continually redeveloped. And this is explored, there's a lovely quote here from Joanna Tai from another article of hers, where she talks about how feedback literacies are less attributes to be possessed, but continually redeveloped and reenacted in response to different situations. This reenactment in response to different situations is really helpful, I think. And also, I think in this work, what I've tried to do is really trouble the idea that feedback literacy is a simple skill and that students may be deficient in that, encouraging us to move away from what Wheelahan and Doyne describe as a skills fetish in higher education. And I love that phrase. We love skills, don't we? But let's move away from the skills fetish and actually think about power relations and the complexity of feedback encounters. To help us do that, these two articles were very much informed by the sociomaterial and posthumanist theories that I mentioned at the outset. So I've got some texts here for anybody that hasn't had the pleasure, I hope it's a pleasure, of beginning to read and think with some of these ideas. I've got some of my favourites and my one, which I can't say is my favourite, but it's mine, on there to get you started. And just to explore some of the work on here, we've got some really nice books. So Undoing the Digital is a book that I'm going to talk more about in a moment, because in this book, Cathy Burnett and Guy Merchant talk about the idea of literacies as events and how we can think about literacies as moments, situated moments, in a really, really helpful way. And they also explore the way literacies are experienced in digital environments. The other book that I want to draw your attention to is Emerging Approaches in Educational Research by Fenwick, Sawchuk and Edwards. And in this book, they explore the tradition of educational research and they suggest what sociomaterial ideas could bring to take it into slightly different direction. And when I first read this book, I thought, wow, it's so different from some of the other ideas that are happening in educational research. This attention to materiality is really, really exciting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those, but there's loads of other really great original, I think, ideas coming through from these areas of scholarship. Vibrant Matter, for example, by Jane Bennett, and she talks about this concept of thing power, where we can focus on the idea that things have power to actually shape and change our experience of learning. And again, I just think it offers a really fresh and original take. So do explore these ideas if you're interested. In this kinds of research. And why might you be interested? Well, I love these quotes from theorists Maggie McClure and Elizabeth Adams St. Pierre. So the first one is, Maggie McClure says that what does theory do? Well, theory offers us new ways to see the world and opens new possibilities for thinking and doing. And this is something that we need in education. We really need new ways and new possibilities for thinking and doing as we look to support a diversity of students in new and different ways. And this quote, now I always think about this quote whenever I read something. One of the things that happens when you read theory, and especially when you study ontology, ways of being, is that the old words don't work anymore. So I'm sure you found this. When you read things and your mind and your thinking shifts, suddenly the old words don't work anymore. So when people now talk to me about their teaching delivery, I don't really understand. I do understand what they mean, but it doesn't really make sense to me that they are trying to deliver their teaching as a little package to their students. Or they talk about content delivery and as teaching. And I think, well, teaching is so much more than the delivery of content from one person to another. So I think it's really helpful to think about why we might want to use theory. And I want to draw upon briefly some of the key concepts that we might wish to use to help our thinking. And these concepts, as I mentioned, have come out of the reading that I've shared and the books that I've shared today. And the first one is a notion called responsibility by Donna Haraway. And rather than just a sort of inconvenient spelling, the idea behind this word is to get us to move away from the traditional interpretation of responsibility as something quite paternalistic, where we have power over another and we have a duty over another. To think about response and how we can respond to a particular situation, to ask ourselves, how are we able to respond to this situation, and how are our students able to respond, recognizing that there are constraints potentially or forces that might impact on our abilities to respond in different ways. I find this really helpful, and I find also the concept from Burnett and Merchant really helpful. And they talk about the literacy as event, and they talk about the idea that the literacy event is its immediate participation in a world of activity larger than its own. So the feedback encounter or the moment of learning happens in a world so much larger than the moment of its own. If we think about our experiences of learning during this conference, the space impacts, the environment impacts, the location, the colleagues and the conversations you're having with your colleagues, it's happening within a world larger than its own. And sociomateriality, again, really helpful. And Fenwick and Sawchuk and Edwards in their book, they talk about how sociomaterial studies are all about revealing the minute dynamics and connections that are continuously enacting the taken for granted in educational events. So it's all about looking at what we take for granted in detail, looking at the small and fine-grained connections and dynamics of encounters. And they talk about how humans and what they take to be their learning do not float distinct in container-like contexts of education. And I love that. Humans and their learning, they don't float removed from the environments around them. So some really helpful ideas to think with there, I think. And then we can move to think about, well, what do these ideas mean for our pedagogy? How do they inform our teaching, our learning, and our assessment? Crucially, how can they help us to think about connections in new ways? How can they help us to think differently about who and what matters in education and in higher education? Thinking about assessment and feedback as a relational act. And I love this quote as well from the educational researcher Diane Mulcahy, and she talks about how relationality comes to the fore, challenging the understanding that a traditional knowing subject lies at the heart of learning, and that this subject is in any way separable from the relations with the world. And actually, this is quite a controversial and revolutionary idea if you take it to its limits. And I remember I was at a conference, the educational conference, ESA, the European Conference of Educational Research, and they were talking about posthumanism. And some people in the audience got really quite angry and cross with the speaker about it. And I remember saying afterwards to a colleague, why do people feel so passionately about, why did they take such aversion to the idea? And he said, well, because it actually really challenges the ways in which we've traditionally understood education as being within the teacher's control. And it's quite an alternative perspective, I think, if we really think about it. Because it leads us to our understanding that teaching is not a cognitive process of information transition. It's affective, it's emergent, it's dynamic, and it's relational. It encourages us, and I explore this in my book, to think about how we might make connections with our students through concepts that we're familiar with. We're really familiar with these as teachers: vulnerability, trust, authenticity, and partnership. But it also encourages us to think about how connections are made with the material, with objects, and it encourages us to think about the effect and vibrancy of things and spaces. So let's start to think a little bit about what this might look like then with relation to assessment and feedback. Well, when we think in this way, it encourages us to recognise that assessment and feedback are entangled in power relations and that they stratify accepted knowledge. So we must think about our feedback encounters as always bound up with power relations, which is really, really interesting, I think. It encourages us to reimagine assessments, to think about and position assessment as a material, discursive doing, as a doing with our students that's impacted by discourses, the discursive, but also materialities. And it encourages us to aim, we don't always get it right, of course, but to try to develop feedback practices as relational, ethical encounters. And I wanted to talk a little bit now about some research that some colleagues and I did with students, in partnership with our students, to explore feedback and their understanding of feedback encounters. And this paper that's just out, we adopted a rich picture method where we asked students to draw how they felt about assessment and feedback. And it was really fascinating because what came through the study was really some of the ideas that we've been thinking with today, the complexity of their experiences of learning at university and the many, many different actors that inform and shape those experiences. do feel free to have a look at the paper, because and the slides are going to be shared after, I believe, because some of the images are just wonderful. Some of them are a bit sad, because we don't want the students to be experiencing these challenges, but they're also really, really thought-provoking. So some of the students talked about how assessment was experienced as like a bomb in their brain, the affective nature of their experience of assessment and feedback practices. But they also, and this is sort of encapsulated in the top left picture, many of them talked about how their experiences of education was always mediated by technologies, by spaces, by teachers, yes, but also by material things. They talked about how they'd open their phone and they'd read their assessment feedback, and it'd just be there on their phone, in their bag. It'd just be so impactful in their hand. And it was just really, really interesting to sort of explore with students how they felt about this complexity. So where does this lead us to? It leads us to thinking about, in our work, this idea that we might move away from the generalizable, move away from the big picture, where we focus on what works, approaches that can be rolled out, that can be understood as consistent or systematic across different environments. But instead, it encourages us to look at the micro practices of our teaching and learning contexts. What's happening with this group of students? What's the detail that I can discern from this particular encounter? And it encourages us to adopt a noticing stance, so asking questions of what's happening. Of course, we can't always fix the problems or the challenges, but we can ask questions and we can notice what's happening in our encounters with students. And I really love this phrase from the critical theorist Leren van, and she talks about the value of a politics of the ordinary. Really just the inherent value of focusing on the everyday, those everyday encounters that we have with students, thinking what happens, what matters in this moment, what can I discern from this particular encounter? And as I mentioned, I explore some of these ideas in greater depth in what I term as relational pedagogies in my book. And also this open access paper that I wrote with colleagues. So if you don't want to buy the book, hopefully you can access the paper, but equally you can always email me if you can't access the paper. I'm more than happy to share. But it is open access, and colleagues and I explored these ideas through what we define as pedagogies of mattering. And in this conception of pedagogies of mattering, relational pedagogies, we think about mattering as both what matters to students, how can we make students feel mattered as in valued, but also we think about how can we turn our attention to the material. I'm not saying dialogue isn't important. I'm not saying teachers aren't important. And I'm not saying students' engagement with feedback isn't important. But also, let's look again at the material. Let's understand relationality as the relationship between students and teachers, but also our entangled relations with a wider array of different actors. And we explore what this might look like and how it might unfold with help and thinking for teaching and learning, for curriculum design, and for assessment and feedback in ways that I hope you'll find helpful. And some of the things that we draw out is the idea that relational pedagogies understood in this way and thinking about relationality really produce shifts in how we think about ontology, epistemology, and ethics. And that's what I was referring to about this sort of, more like the controversial, the sort of bigger shift, because once we think about more about how we might be entangled with our situations and our students, the feedback encounter becomes an ethical moment, as do assessment practices. They become an ethical doing, where we might need to think about how we can really foster ethical practices and produce more inclusive knowledge and research practices. This is the aim, and of course there should be a utopian sort of idealism trigger warning through this, but these are the aims that we're trying to achieve and we're trying to think about. And of course, the other element of thinking about relationality is it really decenters the human. So we're not saying that teachers and students don't matter, but no longer is the human at the forefront of what's happening, but entangled within their situated environment. And for me, what happens is that this thinking and the research that we've been doing raises new questions for our practice. Some of these questions might be really relevant for our work with technologies. For example, we might ask, what do technologies do? And I think this is super helpful actually for those of us who isn't grappling with generative artificial intelligence, because it's about thinking about not just AI as a tool, but thinking about what's its agency, what is it doing, how is it actively shaping our teaching and learning? How can we understand spaces as shaping our experiences of engagement and belonging in different ways? How are connections made in learning encounters? How do students experience a sense of mattering? And crucially, how are teaching and learning relations entangled with matters of power, and how are inequalities produced through the relations of bodies, spaces, and things? So we can think about examples and we can ask these questions of our practice. I mean, a very, very simple one is a few years ago, a lot of my teachers were telling me that students would never come and engage with them and have feedback conversations. And I was saying, why? And they were saying, well, you know, I have my office hours and I put on my door the times that I'm available. And then when we spoke to those students, they told us that they didn't really understand what office hours were. They couldn't make that particular hour. There were many, many reasons why they couldn't engage with that particular practice that actually were quite material. They were about time, they were about space, they were about the understanding of the practice. So there's many ways that we can look at this and explore this in detail. So we can think about feedback practices and potentially think about and understand the material constraints that might prevent or alternatively encourage and foster engagement. We can seek to pay attention to students' day-to-day learning practices through developing an ongoing noticing stance, with the caveat that this is not always achievable. These are values, and values are sometimes inevitably constrained when we have huge classes and we have high workloads. But thinking about some of these as practices to work to is incredibly helpful, even if we might just enact them in small moments, because sometimes small moments can really matter. It's thinking about the variety and diversity of feedback practices and perhaps engaging in multiple approaches, maybe recorded screencasts, videos, dialogue, online communities of practice, and of course we know already the importance of formative opportunities for feedback. It's about adopting wherever possible and seeking to find ways to adopt openness and presence. And it's also about trying to get to know our students and trying to get to know our individual students. Again, this is idealistic, but an aim to work for through dialogic approaches and through staying in touch, while still being mindful of the complexity of dialogue. And I wanted to talk to you briefly about how we have tried to think about some of these questions and some of these relational encounters in my programme at the University of Surrey in order to bring to life, with a particular example, some of the things that I've been thinking about and talking about today. So the relational pedagogies for us are something that's much more than a theoretical undertaking. And in my programme, we recently redesigned and revalidated it a few years ago. And we broke the programme up into smaller groups of 15 with a tutor. It's a large programme of 120 participants who are all teachers in higher education. We were looking to create opportunities for ongoing dialogue and ongoing formative feedback. And we actually have the culmination of the programme has a programmatic assessment design with an oral conversation at its close. So the idea is very much about getting to know participants. It's about enacting a politics of the ordinary, where we get to know participants and we have regular opportunities for formative feedback in different spaces and places, recognising the constraints and power relations that might happen. It also includes, and this is really important, but running through it is a specific theme. They're not modules because it's programmatic, but a theme which is called Different Voices. And in that theme, Different Voices, we have an online, small private online course, a SPOC, where we interview and have online recordings with staff and students who share their experiences of feedback practices and their different experiences of learning. And that's really important for us, that we can then talk about those diverse voices, recognising the different ways in which students might engage or might not be able to engage in their learning. And lastly, something else that we have tried to do wherever possible, and actually this is evidenced in the SPOC, the small private online course I mentioned, is work with students in collaborative partnership. And students co-designed the SPOC with us, and we also draw upon their expertise throughout to try and think about the ways in which inclusion of different voices challenges and problematizes some of the power relations that occur within our teaching and our learning. So coming to a close now, and I really want to hear about your questions and thoughts about some of this, and perhaps how you're doing similar things or in your own practice. I want to just pull out some key thoughts. And the first is that feedback literacies understood in this way are understood as complex, as nuanced, as dynamic and crucially as situated in specific moments. They're also understood as entangled by social, material, discursive, spatial and temporal factors. So really entangled within our particular moments. For us, this leads to the need to understand the varied reasons in which individual students may be able to engage or may be disengaged, to probe at the complexity of disengagement, where I started at the beginning of this session. It encourages us to problematize taken for granted descriptions of engagement with feedback as a binary, dialogic event that just happens between teacher and student without the agency or impact of anything beyond that. And there's a real need for further research in order to greater understand the lived and messy realities of diverse students. And this is changing so much. I mean, at my university, and I hope this isn't happening for you, but there's lots and lots of concern about students not wanting to turn up and being really reluctant to come to classes anymore. And engagement patterns are happening. They're changing. We're running to catch up because we don't really understand. And we need to understand because the messy realities of how students engage are changing and evolving. And I just want to close by just suggesting this sort of throwing out this hope that relational pedagogies understood in this way can potentially foster more caring and ethical ways of working with students by encouraging us to notice our institutions and learning spaces anew. Just an idea to think with and to take forward. So thank you so much for your attention and listening to my talk today. I'm going to come to a close now. And thank you. And over to you. And I think we've still got some really nice time for some questions, and I will try to answer them.
Yes, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation.
I'm so sorry, I forgot that I was asked actually to ask you to stand up if you're happy to, because apparently for the video,
yes, I'm happy
it makes
to stand
it really
up.
clear. So
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, I was just wondering, could you give us an example of an ethical situation in the encounter between students and teachers?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's a couple of examples that we could potentially draw upon. I'm thinking of an example that we took from a student in the paper that I wrote with David Carless on exploring feedback literacies as events, sort of moments, encounters in the moment. And one of our participants in that paper told us about how they were really not enjoying university very much, and they told us that they had really struggled, in their words, struggled to engage. And they said that one of the reasons was that they didn't really find online communication with their tutor very helpful. But when they tried to come in, the times that their tutor was available were not times that fitted with their childcare arrangements. They were a mature student. They were a mature student from a diverse background with young children. They struggled to make the time to engage with their tutor, but also, and I think this is really important and increasingly becoming important for our students and perhaps yours, they were really reluctant or struggled to find the money to pay for the car parking and the travel. And there were these sort of really material barriers. So she was saying to me, well, you know, I get email comments, but what I really want to do is actually sit in person with my tutor and show him my assignment and go through it. But actually, when I try to do that, there's sort of all these barriers. I feel like the timing's wrong, or I'm worried about spending the money or whatever. And this was particularly just one illustrative example. But for me, it raised quite a lot of ethical questions that don't have clear answers, but that we might want to think about. So the ethical questions are, for example, you know, how much should we expect our students who are signed up on our courses to be able to be forced to engage at set times on a physical campus? How much should we mitigate and make allowances for students' diverse circumstances? How much realistically can teachers be expected to adapt to diverse students' needs? So there's ethical situations on both sides, I think, for the student. Completely empathised with her challenges, but also I was thinking that I probably empathise with the teacher as well. And so I think thinking about, when we think about the feedback as an event situated in a wider world and focus on all these material barriers, potentially forces, so we know, for example, that the cost of living crisis is hugely impacting on students' participation. Thinking about just that material force of the cost of coming to campus, the cost of engaging in university in the ways that we would expect students to, it leads us to new ethical questions about our practices and how much we should or want to adapt and evolve. And there are no clear answers, but I think it's really helpful to actually notice these changes that are happening and think with our colleagues about what we might want to do or we might want to try in order to respond to them. Thank you. I hope that answers your question. Do you have any experiences of something similar in your university? Or thank you.
Well, yes, we do, because we have adult students.
Yeah.
And they work and study at the same time. Yeah. So they have huge time constraints. Yeah. And we're always looking for ways to, well, adapt to their situation and at the same time try to guard our own time. Yeah. So this is if you can call it an ethical question, it is.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you raise, because relational pedagogies are not these fluffy approaches that require academics and teachers to do more. And one of the things that I unpack in my research is actually the emotional labour required of teachers to care. The gendered nature of caring practices, the complexity and power relations underpinning teachers' requirement to care, to do more, and to work in these ways. And so we also need to look out for teachers and academics, particularly in the current climate where workloads are increasing. In the UK, we're experiencing a lot of redundancies and a shrinking higher education sector, which is putting a lot of stress and additional load on teachers. So there's ethical issues that we need to think about from both teacher side and student side as we think about the complexity of these interactions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It gives a lot of food for thought, I think. And it's therefore that I haven't got my question clear, but I was wondering, we are at our school, we are having a teacher practice. So a lot of what you've taught is about pedagogies and about the relationship you have with students. So you were giving your presentation and I thought, I did the right thing with a student last week when giving her feedback in a conversation because I adapted to her personal situation. But I also wondered, we're very busy with the competence of being autonomous in your own learning process. So we're more coaches, more guides in their learning process, and students are encouraged to take the lead in their learning process, and I think that's one of the most difficult things to give feedback on, because it's also connected to what their abilities are in material or space or time. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the self-regulation of students in this process?
Thank you. Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? And I completely agree and support the notion of working with our students to foster independence, to develop self-regulation, and to learn and practice and enhance their autonomy as learners. These things still really matter. They're still really important. However, for me, it's also important to acknowledge openly that these skills, practices, are developed in situated ways. So something that worried me when I read David Carless and David Bowd's paper on the student feedback literacy was this sole focus on feedback literacy as being defined as something that students could learn. So managing affect, making judgments, taking action, all sort of skills. And the idea, perhaps implicit or perhaps just on my reading, that those students that did not perform those practices and demonstrate those skills were somehow in deficit. And I reflected upon, again, and apologies to bring COVID back to the forefront of our minds, but I reflected again on my own ability to engage as a teacher during that time. And I was really struck by how sort of incompetent I became. As, you know, somebody who thought that I was usually quite on top of my work, suddenly with homeschooling my different aged children, at the same time as working full time, at the same time as covering the administration for my administrator who'd been furloughed, working in just one room with my husband at home, or also worrying about health and health worries and all of those things. I was suddenly unable to regulate myself or act in any way that was in any way near my normal standard of conduct, shall we say. So I'm absolutely sure that this is already something that you are doing and aware of, the need to understand and respond to students in situ. But I worry that if we don't think of it like that, the discourse around feedback literacy being understood as something just the student does misses a lot of that nuance, a lot of that mess that we see in the day-to-day practices of learning, whether we're teaching or learning as staff or students. And I think it's really super helpful, and probably even becoming even more important to look at that mess and that nuance as we have diverse students with different needs and different struggles, and just greater complexity across all of our programs. So yeah, really, really great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just like Lou, I'm still shaping my question in my head. I'm just wondering whether the physical environment could have an influence as well, because very practical, we have a very old building and a very new building. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, huge. They're huge, absolutely. Something that we talk about a lot with our developing teachers is the physical space. I don't know if many of you have had this experience that I have had quite a lot of trying to do sort of an interactive teaching session or a session with some sort of discussion in like a really old-fashioned tiered lecture theatre, maybe like a huge space, because that's the only space that is available for your session. We know that the different spaces that we have, the physical environment is huge for how we feel in a particular moment. We know that. Think about how we feel here. I mean, I'm sure we've all been to so many academic conferences which are not like this one, which are stuffy, and you're in the corner and it's dark, and you feel like, oh, I wish I could have some fresh air, and it's tiring. They're normally really tiring, I find. But something about the freedom and the flexibility and the sunshine, of course, and the wonderful venue here really changes the way we feel. So we know then that teaching and learning is profoundly emotional and affective, but often we just don't want to sort of acknowledge that. We want to just pretend it's something that we can deliver in a really quite, much more straightforward way. But actually, the spaces that we learn and that we teach within, those physical buildings, really impact upon the ways in which we feel. And when I think about feedback, I often think about one of my first experiences of feedback, critical feedback, when I was a student, an undergraduate student, and my first experience was just so impactful. I was first in my family to go to university. I was really nervous. That first assessment that you hand in, it's so important, isn't it, about whether you feel that sense of acceptance or not. And unfortunately, I got a U, ungradable. And I just remember having a conversation, and I guess I should count myself lucky that I was given the opportunity to have a dialogue with my professor, this very senior sort of white male in a wood-panelled, a really large sort of a very beautiful wood-panelled office. You wouldn't get those now, perhaps. But he had this really lovely wood-panelled office, and he sat behind this desk, and I went in, and he told me why I'd just failed so miserably. And the whole space, the feeling of being in that environment that was very, very imbued with power relations all over it, had just like a really, really long-lasting impact on me and my sort of understanding of how students feel, and not just students, us, we still feel upset by feedback and impacted by feedback, but how people feel by feedback and how the spaces in which we teach and learn can shape. And sometimes we can't do anything about the spaces in which we teach and learn. Sometimes we're given a session and we just have to make the best of it. But I think thinking about it and acknowledging with our students, oh, this space is not that great for this, but let's do this. Or thinking about, can we actually take our students and go outside? Can we have a walk? Can we learn outside? I love the work of Bell Hooks, another critical pedagogic theorist, and she talks about how she had the same problem with office hours, that her students weren't coming. So one day, she got them all to meet in the lunch hall, and they all had lunch together. And then they all just started chatting. And there was something about the power of food, eating together, having lunch together in a different space, in the cafeteria. It broke down power relations. It said, I'm not just your professor. I'm going to come out from my oak panelled room. Maybe she didn't have an oak panelled room, but you know what I'm saying. Actually, I'm going to come out from my space and I'm actually going to come and eat with you and share with you. And it's not going to be scary and it's going to be different. So I think the physical, the material is something we shouldn't forget about. We should keep problematizing it and talking about it and talking about its impact on feedback. How
New
about
building,
you?
which is very pretty. It has nice windows and very nice furniture. I have actually, mainly because we have a new building, which is very pretty. It has nice windows and very nice furniture and nice colors. And then we have an older building that they are thinking about either refurbishing or rebuilding. And that discussion has been going on forever. So that's just how it goes. And I think we're all hoping very much for new build, because that can really change things, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. And also that's, it's an important point that you raise about, who gets to decide on how spaces are designed as well. When the spaces are created, who do they represent? Whose voices are enacted and present in those spaces? Often it's not always teachers who are, able to say, oh, this is what we really need. But thinking about how spaces are designed and how we can use them is so important. Yeah, thank you so much. How much we're doing for time? Got a bit of time.
Thank you. I was wondering, because you already mentioned, office hours don't always work, but giving good feedback is much better than in person.
Yeah, of course.
How do you feel about, because I always feel that students, they don't show up when I feel like they should.
Yeah.
But they kind of, when they get the assessment, they sort of just, they're done. Like, they don't really feel that need for feedback. Yeah. How do you feel about, creating that sense of urgency with students, that feedback is part of their learning process?
Thank you. Yeah, this is such an ongoing challenge that I'm sure we all experience or have experienced in our teaching. The frustration when you've spent so long crafting your feedback with care and when it's not picked up even, and it's just lying in a feedback graveyard is really a real thing. Some of the ways in which we've tried to think about that, and I'm not saying we've got it right, there's still ongoing problems, of course, but some of the things we tried to do is to move away from giving really any summative feedback of that much consequence and actually moving the feedback to formative throughout. So as I mentioned, so if I talk about the PG Cert in learning, teaching and higher education, the assessment is an oral conversation, an hour-long viva at the end. And after that, they get a little bit of feedback, but really not very much, because what happens is the work before, throughout the 18-month course, we have regular opportunities for formative feedback. And they are written, the feedback is written, but I will always say, would you like to talk through it as well? I'm more than happy to do that, and some people do want to do that. But the other thing that we do to try and help with the engagement is have lots of conversations. And of course, this is important for students too, even more so. My participants are staff, but it's still important for them, about what feedback is and why we should engage with it, and how actually feedback, like learning, is a shared responsibility. As teachers, we can spend ages crafting a beautiful session, really put our heart and soul into that session. But it also requires commitment and engagement from our learners to meet us, to make it effective, to make it happen. And I think it's the same with feedback. So we have lots of conversations about what work is required to engage with feedback and how that might happen. But we also think really carefully about the opportunities for feedback, how it's given, opportunities for dialogue, the spaces in which those dialogues can happen. We also provide opportunities for peer feedback. So in our tutorials, getting colleagues to feedback on one another's work is really, really helpful. But I think in general, the move away from that sort of I've done my program now, I've done my assessment, the feedback is not helpful, and moving feedback earlier, but also when we're writing and crafting our feedback, thinking about making the feedback really future relevant beyond just the assessment, but really future focused. But at the same time, we mustn't, beat ourselves up, because we're all trying and doing things, and sometimes they don't always work, and they also require students to engage. And I think it is an ongoing challenge. But yeah, one I empathise with very much. Thank you. Are we done? Yuso.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. I'm really inspired by this idea of making relational pedagogies work in environments that are not always built for that, sometimes in a very concrete way, such as with buildings, that always meant for relational pedagogies.
Yeah.
And one of the aspects of that influenced my work, that is a very good example of this, is the creating practices and policies that we have.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you have any insights, particularly based on the wonderful program that you have redesigned, if you have any insights on creating from the viewpoint of relational pedagogies, because in most institutions we do need to provide numerical or letter grades, and it's not always a very relational process. So
No.
what do you think?
I think it's really hard. It's really hard. And the program that we designed just met with sort of ongoing barriers where universities were not designed for this. So I'm thinking about, we decided to adopt this programmatic assessment structure with the view of undoing some of the barriers of thinking in silos that modules can sometimes create, and also encouraging the formative relations to develop towards the oral conversation. But the first barrier, one of the most key barriers that we experienced was that the systems that we use, the quality systems, could not cope with the fact that our program didn't have a module. And even now, they still ask me for the module descriptor, and they just can't. But there must be, but there isn't. But there needs to be. And it was this conversation about, well, we know that the research literature says that programmatic assessment can be really, really helpful, but the system, we need it for the system. And which should come first? Should the system determine learning, or should the educational researchers determine learning? So these things are not easy. And similarly with the buildings on our campus, particularly before COVID and more blended and hybrid learning came in, they were all developing these 500 sort of tiered lecture theatres, or many of them were. I make generalisations. So sometimes our universities are not designed for the kinds of critical and relational pedagogies we as teachers might want to enact. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, and we can't push and we can't make changes. And even though these kinds of pedagogies are hard, and they are, as I said, the trigger warning for idealism and utopian thinking is very real here, I still believe that small changes can make a difference. And actually, the more that we talk about the kinds of educational futures that we think are important, the kinds of university practice that we think matter, the more little changes become incremental. And those marginal gains can sometimes gather together and produce a momentum, I think. But yeah, that's my view. What about you, Yuso? What's your thoughts?
I very, very much sympathize with this. From my point of view, for me, it's not really the old buildings. They're a bit annoying, but I can handle that. For me, it's really grades. That's the thing that kind of interrupts the relational aspects of teaching and learning.
Can you explain that a bit more?
I'm trying to reorganize my thoughts in a way that I'm not blaming students for being very grade-oriented, but sometimes I teach in Hong Kong, which is a very competitive environment. But I do have to say that when I was teaching in Finland, it was also an issue. It's not because of the students, it's because of a system that we have built that really focuses on grades. So that's often a very profound part of the system that steers student motivation and teacher workload as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And sometimes it is just about, making small changes, isn't it? And being really explicit about what you're trying to achieve and why, having those conversations. Yeah, thank you. maybe we're done. We ready for the break? Yeah. Any further questions? Yeah. Oh. Thank you everyone for your questions and for listening. I really enjoyed it.